Hello, my lovely listeners. I'm Dr. Mary Barson.
And I'm Dr. Lucy Burns. Welcome to this episode of Real Health and Weight Loss. Hello, gorgeous ones. Dr. Lucy here this morning, and I do have a treat for you, a no sugar treat, of course. Now, we get asked all the time our thoughts on the carnivore diet, which is, of course, an animal-based diet. Now, as you all know, Dr. Mary and I are omnivores. We both eat meat and vegetables, but we wanted to get experts on the carnivore diet to come and have a chat with us. And we have two today. I have Dr. Max Gulhane, who is speaking at the Low Carb Roadshow in Melbourne, and Dr. Suresh Khirwadkar, who is speaking at Low Carb Brisbane. So, lovelies, just sit back and enjoy. Good morning, gorgeous listeners. I am joined this morning by a really exceptional person who I think you're going to love listening to him. His name is Dr. Max Gulhane, and look, I first met him about 4 years ago when I was presenting at a conference called Low Carb for Doctors, and Max was a final year medical student. And the thing that struck me about him was that as a medical student, he was already questioning the dogma. And most medical students, including myself as a medical student and in fact as a doctor for many years, just listened and believed every single word I was taught. And Max is already thinking outside the box. So I am super happy to welcome Max to the podcast, and I would love you to listen to his story. Max, welcome.
Thank you, Lucy. Thanks so much for having me on.
Mate, I'm very happy for you to be here, and I'd love to hear your story. So you're a low carb aficionado as a doctor, and I know carnivore, regenerative farmer, all of those sorts of things, which not many, certainly medical students, junior doctors are in your sphere. So I would love to hear, how's that come about for you?
I grew up in a household where low fat kind of dietary guideline was very much implemented and very much the norm. We had cereal every morning, oats, these kind of foods, but we still ate a little bit of meat. But basically, as I got older, particularly in my late adolescence and early 20s, I developed some acne, and it was pretty persistent acne. And as you can imagine, it wasn't very aesthetically pleasing, especially to a young adult. Around this time, I was in early medical school, and, in addition to following the normal eating patterns, I was also experimenting with a lower meat intake and increasing my plant intake, because like a lot of people, I thought that was the best thing for me, best thing for the environment, and best thing for the planet. And I distinctly remember one day, getting out of my car in medical school and just feeling so tired and so exhausted. And the question popped up into my head, is this what it's supposed to be like? I mean, am I always going to feel like this? And around that same time, the acne that I was suffering was basically apogee. It was just horrible. And I was having very, very bad bloating symptoms, just recurrent colds and illnesses that year. And I thought, this can't be right. So somehow I can't exactly remember, I stumbled upon the Low Carb Down Under YouTube channel. And at this point, it was interesting because I was studying medicine. I had the scientific kind of basis and background, but I was hearing very, very different opinions about disease and about the development of disease, and particularly these lifestyle causes of disease. So I delved into that, and part of that was attending some low carb events. And that's where I met you, Lucy. And I also met Dr. Rob Sabo, who is a very experienced GP in reversing diabetes. And at that point, I just experimented on myself, and I began to cut out a lot of the foods that I had been eating. I cut out the oats. I cut out the up and go, breakfast drinks.
Oh, good.
Full of sugar. I cut out the fruit, and I really cut out the nuts and the legumes and all these type of foods. And what I noticed is that my symptoms improved. So the acne went away, my bloating went away. I felt just better in myself. And then finally, just before I, finished medical school, I was at lunch and I made myself a a salad. So I was keto by then, or low carb. I was eating a salad with some kangaroo, and I'd eaten the kangaroo. I was very satiated and I felt great. And I was picking amongst the spinach leaves, and I looked at them, and I wasn't enjoying eating them at all. And I asked myself, like, is this necessary? And around the same time, doctors like Dr. Sean Baker and Dr. Paul Saladino were really promoting an idea of exclusively animal-based eating. So getting rid, not only ketogenic or not only low carb, but actually removing any food that isn't of animal origin. So that was the next step for me. And cutting those out, I found I had an extremely interesting experience, Lucy, that almost bordered on almost like a religious experience. And essentially, I had a couple of weeks of intense euphoria and an amazing energy, boundless energy and creativity. And that point was when I went exclusively carnivore. After that point, I was feeling great and very much on board with this low carbohydrate approach. The thing that I want to also mention, and I guess I didn't before, was that I was that patient. And particularly with regard to my acne treatment, I went through the standard medical approach. So I was prescribed topical anti-acne treatments, then topical antibiotics, then oral antibiotics, doxycycline, then minocycline, a different antibiotic, and then finally Roaccutane, which is a synthetic retinol drug, and it's actually an adjuvant chemotherapeutic agent as well. I didn't have a great reaction to that and essentially self-ceased. But I want to give your listeners an idea that I understood how the mainstream medical pharmaceutical-based approach isn't serving a lot of patients, because I guess I was in that position myself. So fast forward another couple of years, and I've been basically 95% meat, 80 to 95% meat throughout this past 3 or 4 years. And now I've just moved down to Albury, New South Wales to commence my general practice training here with Dr. Rob Sabo, who I mentioned earlier. And yeah, implementing low carb, implementing carnivore in certain patients, and yeah, having amazing results.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? And look, I remember listening to an interview from Sean Baker maybe 3-4 years ago, and I initially wasn't even going to bother, because in my brain I'm going, carnivore, what a load of crock. I'm not listening to this. This is bullshit. And then I just thought, oh, actually, Lucy, listen to yourself. You're being very closed here. Listen to it and see what you think. So I listened and I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I became a little more curious. Now, as I'm always saying, I'm actually a loud and proud omnivore. I do enjoy my vegetables. I have no issues with them. They don't cause me any particular harm. I suspect that my body can process them in whatever way. But for some people, as you said, this idea, which seems so foreign and so different to what we've all been taught and believe, that to at least be curious about it, and at least as a doctor consider it as an offering to your patients, I think is amazing.
Yeah, look, I think there's a spectrum of sensitivity to plant-based foods, and people like you, Lucy, are completely fine to eat these type of foods, and it doesn't affect you. You feel great. And then on that other end of the spectrum, people particularly with severe autoimmune disease or other kinds of severe inflammatory conditions, basically have just, in my opinion, have a very, very small buffer or allowance for plant-based foods. And I think maybe your listeners know of Michaela Peterson, who is the daughter of Jordan Peterson. She's probably a great example of that, and had a range of inflammatory arthritis that basically required or was able to keep her symptoms in control with only a meat and salt-based diet. But I'm not dogmatic by any means, and I don't think we can be dogmatic as doctors and clinicians. So I'm basically there to support my patients and give them options. And for some people, that option is just a plain low carbohydrate diet. But there's some people who I think particularly will benefit from exclusively a meat-based diet. And these patients are often young men or, older guys. They're busy. They love steak. They like eating meat. And it's a really good way of simplifying the approach for them. And I simply just say, do you like steak? Yes. Use steak, use salt, and, eat as much as you can, as much as you need. And they love it. And the results they have and the simplicity of it is amazing. I give the analogy of Steve Jobs. You know, Steve Jobs used to every day walk into his cupboard and there were 10 Polo necks, 10 pairs of Levi's and 10 New Balance sneakers. And it just removes decision fatigue, so much decision fatigue and cognitive effort about what we're going to eat that could better be used, you know, dealing with the rest of the stresses for life. So that's my general approach or how I think about it.
You know what? I love the idea, the reframe of something, you know, because sometimes people will say, oh, it's so boring. How can you just do that? That's so boring. And I think, that's a thought. That's your brain's attaching meaning to it. You could use that sentence, it's so boring, or you could use the sentence, it's so easy. And I love the idea that it's easy. I mean, I was thinking recently I went on a little trip to America and I was looking at the movie list and there were initially 5 films that were available. And I thought, one of those I was happy to watch. And then there was a little button that said more options. And I go, I'll click on that. And there were 150 movie options. And I reckon I spent half an hour looking through, making sure that I'd had the best choice because, you know, what if I wasted 2 hours on a movie when there was actually a better one available? And so all of this took up, as you said, brain space, decision fatigue, and this idea that I would somehow be unsatisfied because there may have always been a better option. Whereas when your options are less, you just pick one and you're happy with it.
Yeah, no, that's a bit of a metaphor for life as well. But I think there's a couple points there. One speaks to modern societal use of food as entertainment. And I don't think food should be entertainment. It should be pleasurable, but it shouldn't be necessarily the person's primary source of entertainment. Food is fundamentally nourishment. Food is fundamentally nutrition that allows you to build the structure of your body, allows it to operate optimally, and then allows you to give your gift to the world, whether that's through your work, through looking after your family, going on weekends. This is the goal in my mind. And I think food should help people get there. And if people are more preoccupied about taste or they're using, you know, sugary and carb foods as their source of entertainment, then they're going to pay for that, you know, 10, 20, 30 years down the track. And they're not going to be able to enjoy their life because they simply haven't taken care of their body. And on to your second point, it does on the surface appear to be restrictive, but in many ways, discipline equals freedom. And this is my experience and my patient's experience, when we condense those options into just meat, animal-based food, and a small number of dishes, then what we find is that it is intensely nourishing, and then it becomes a process where we're not having to worry, as you said, about everything else and all those other extraneous buyer's regret or that you can get when you have all these other food options. So look, that's my take on it. Look, and as you said, it's not suitable for everyone, but for the people who it does work for, it works very well.
Oh, absolutely. And as you said, acne is, you know, for a lot of people, acne is an inflammatory condition. You know, there's a couple of different, I guess, causes of that inflammatory disorder, and we will, you know, be looking at bacteria and all of those sorts of things. But it's interesting, isn't it, that despite all of our knowing, here you are able to manage it, you know, dare I say, cure it, simply by changing your food. We love that phrase that real food is medicine. And it's so interesting to me that there are some doctors who are completely disinterested in that concept. You know, and in fact, there's a guy who's written a book called Food is Not Medicine. And I just think, how can you say that? As a doctor, how can you say that?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I really conceive of our role or medicine and lifestyle medicine. I conceive it as basically 3 steps. And if you think about the bottom step, that's someone who's dying. And the middle step is someone who's merely surviving. And the top step is someone who's thriving. So pills and pharmaceutical interventions and mainstream medicine gets us from dying to merely surviving. But if you want to go from surviving to thriving, you're going to need a diet and lifestyle. And the fact is most of our colleagues, Lucy, are only occupied at that transition from the first to the second step. That would be okay, sure, if it didn't imply that so many patients aren't being served and are being let down by the advice that they're getting. And by failing to get proper dietary advice, and say in my case, how many unnecessary years of not only symptomatic acne, but potential adverse effects from a very strong anti-acne medication like isotretinoin, which causes birth defects incidentally. So any young woman who gets put on it has to be strictly on birth control, hormonal contraceptives. So all that to say, I think it should be an option. Doctors need to be at least giving patients the option of a lifestyle, best gold standard lifestyle option. And the patient is up to them if they don't want to take that advice, but at least it should be offered before, they reach for the prescription pad.
I totally agree. And, this has been one of the themes that's been coming through all the interviews with people who are speaking at the Low Carb Roadshow is this idea that because the advice we've often been taught about lifestyle, and particularly, for me, as you know, I'm in weight loss and weight management, the advice for that was eat less, move more, calorie restrict, reduce, and that is unsustainable and doesn't work. So then what happens is that doctors go, well, yeah, okay, lifestyle. All right, tick lifestyle, but it's not the lifestyle we're talking about. It's old-fashioned, if you like, old advice that doesn't work. So no wonder people go, oh, yeah, lifestyle, it's not going to work. This is really, frontier medicine, and I love it, and I love the idea that, people like you and all the other speakers are the pioneers of lifestyle change, and the beneficiaries of that are our patients.
Yeah. And look, I don't blame, our colleagues, but I really feel like they don't have a good framework for thinking about optimal health. And you can see, because many of our colleagues are themselves overweight. The cells look insulin resistant. So the fact is that they're unable to give good lifestyle advice because they simply, one, don't understand it themselves, and two, probably haven't been able to implement anything like that themselves. So yeah, it's really, I think, a common theme in the people that you've interviewed and the people that I've interviewed on my podcast is that doctors who have this approach have had to go through their own journey with the medical system, or weight gain, or insulin resistance and diabetes. And without that personal journey, I haven't seen a lot of clinicians, practicing in this way.
No, you're right. And that is, I think, again, medicine, we would be scathing about the N=1 experiment and, it's anecdotal and all of those sorts of things. But unless you've walked the walk, most people won't talk the talk. So you're right, there is absolute buy-in from all of the doctors who are speaking at the Low Carb Roadshow because they have a personal story that brings them to low carb nutrition, whether that is low carb, keto, carnivore. They have their own experience with it. And I think that's so empowering, because I think that for a lot of people, if you're, let's say you're a patient with type 2 diabetes who's overweight, who's been overweight for a long, long time, who's tried diets, they've tried Weight Watchers, and they're sitting across the desk from a young, and I'm stereotyping here, absolutely stereotyping, but a young, perhaps dietitian who's never had a weight problem, there is a disconnect in how that person can give the advice if they've never had to experience any suffering like that.
Yeah, no, I agree with that completely. And I talked last on Thursday night at a restaurant event that we did with Jake Wolke, who's a good friend of mine, a regenerative farmer. And we had 4 courses of the regenerative produce, and there were 2 speeches, and Jake talked about regenerative farming and I talked about the Australian dietary guidelines and how they haven't served patients. And the end of my talk, I basically made the point that there is a collective trauma around food and diet in Australia and the world as a result of dietary guidelines and this, as you mentioned, a low-fat paradigm, the eat less and move more. And it's a trauma because people have been told to do one thing that clearly doesn't work, and they're just emotionally scarred from it. So I agree. And to have some young dietitian, reading these essentially propaganda dressed up as, health advice, out to someone who's lived in their body, been in their body, tried all these dietary approaches, yeah, I mean, no wonder they don't gel or they don't, relate to each other. So yeah, there has been a trauma, and what I hope I'm doing and is really empathizing with patients. And I say to them, it's not your fault. You have been given the wrong advice. And often that conversation takes 5 or 10 minutes of really empathizing and trying to make them realize that they've been given the bum steer. But then here's something that might work. And, already having patients coming back, 12 days later with 4 kilos of weight loss, feeling so much more energetic. And that's just it feels great and it's very rewarding. And that's why I love doing what I do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. And I think that's been certainly the theme from all the doctors that are interviewed, is that this is so rewarding. This type of medicine is so rewarding, because the standard type of way healthcare is delivered in our society at the moment is short appointments, usually resulting in some sort of script of some sort. So you're either maintaining multiple medications or adding to them. And that just becomes disempowering. And I think the two people that probably see, that for whose career felt soul destroying was I spoke with Gary Fettke, who's an orthopedic surgeon, who just felt terrible having to amputate limbs. Like, what an awful, you can imagine his job, chopping people's feet off, like how soul destroying. Or Dr. James Mukey, the Australian of the Year, who was seeing people going blind from conditions that are preventable and treatable if given the right advice early enough.
Yeah, look, and I'm not surprised. I mean, there's GP shortages everywhere, and if they're practicing the standard way, as Dr. Penny Featree says, I watch my patients get sicker and sicker and prescribe more and more medications. That's enough to cause distress in the doctor, whether it's amputating or watching people go blind or simply, watching them become more and more obese and overweight and metabolically sick. It's enough to make someone not want to do that job. So yeah, this approach I think is not only necessary for it to help our patients, but to help the profession as general practitioners.
Absolutely. Well, Max, I can tell you Melbourne, low carb Melbourne, is going to be in for a treat listening to your talk. I just love the fact that, you have, as I said, you haven't waited till like us where we're 20 years down the track going, God, there's got to be a better way. Your patients, I mean, how lucky are they? They're going to have decades of you not burning out, enthusiastic, looking after them and really offering them an option for a better way to take them from surviving to thriving. And I just love that.
Yeah, every day I walk in and I'm next to Dr. Rob Sabo, and, we like the energy in the room. We get up, we're like, all right, let's go reverse some diabetes. Like, let's help some people lose some weight. And we just keep bouncing off each other. We discuss our patient stories, and yeah, the energy's high, and the energy in this town in Albury is high because we're mixing regenerative agriculture, the highest quality food, with holistic health, with low carbohydrate nutrition, carnivore nutrition, and things are happening here. So yeah, it's really good energy.
Excellent. So lovely. Max, if our listeners are wanting to connect with you, and I'm quite sure they will be, where do they find you?
Yeah, so I have a podcast called the Regenerative Health Podcast, talking to low carb doctors. Lucy was episode number 9, I believe. So you can find that podcast on all the podcasting apps, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, on YouTube as well. I'm on Instagram, Dr_Max_Gulhane, and Twitter at mgulhanemd. So yeah, those are my handles, and I'm consulting at the Gardens Medical Group, Albury. So you can ring up and make an appointment if you're local, or if you're not local, if you want to drive, you can see me. I'm happy to see you. So yeah, that's how you can connect with me.
Wonderful. And we will have all those links in the show notes, lovelies. And again, if you want to come and listen to Max and meet him in person, you can do so at Low Carb Melbourne, which is on May the 7th coming up. Great. Well, that was Dr. Max speaking. And now, of course, I'm having a chat with Dr. Suresh. See you soon, lovelies. Gorgeous ones, it's Dr. Lucy here to introduce you to another fabulous doctor who I've had the pleasure of meeting. He's a dead set legend, and I'm super happy to introduce you to him. He will be speaking at Low Carb Brisbane Roadshow, so that's even better. But today, lovelies, I'd love to introduce you to Dr Suresh Khirwadkar. He is a lifestyle medicine physician, a bit like me, and we're going to talk a bit about that today, but he's not. So Lifestyle Medicine College often recommends plant-based nutrition. And as you know, Dr. Mary and I are loud and proud omnivores, but Suresh is a carnivore. So let's have a chat about his journey and, just a few little nitty-gritties around the carnivore movement and, who it's helpful for. And perhaps I'll ask his expertise on whether it's not helpful for some people. So Suresh, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Lucy. It's great to be here today.
Excellent. Good. So I'd love to hear a bit about your journey. And, it sounds like you've been on a similar quest to me, recognising that the current state of medicine is not helpful in identifying root causes, that, going down that lifestyle medicine pathway usually indicates that people are much keener to address stuff upstream.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, we can talk about this, the short version or the long version, depending on what you and the listeners might want. But I mean, the short version is really, since very early on in my career, I've wanted to practice in a different way. Really, medical school teaches us to pass the exams. It doesn't teach us to be a doctor most of the time. And then you kind of learn on the job, how to be a doctor. But when you're a junior doctor, and I trained in the UK, so it may be different in Australia, it may be different in the States, but I'm assuming it's the same, pretty much all over the world. Being a junior doctor teaches you how to generally prescribe, and it's all about the medications. And, you're working often in the hospital system, the guidelines there. It's all about the medications. It's never about the lifestyle, the diet, the exercise. Diet, may play a small role. But then you see people in the hospital, after surgeries and so forth, and they're just given the most garbage food. Diet is clearly not a key factor when it comes to what you're learning as a junior doctor. And nobody really talks about sleep or really mental health and how this can pertain to physical health. And so I was very lucky, actually, early on in my career. I was taught by some excellent doctors who really instilled in me the idea of actually deprescribing and stopping medications. And I owe really my career to them. And they just happen to be geriatric consultants, so, elderly care. And I think that's where it really is very evident that medications can cause a problem. Polypharmacy, lots of medications, lots of side effects, interacting all with each other. I was always taught to kind of try and deprescribe where we can. And that really started me off on this journey. And ever since then, I've been really looking for a different way of working, because so much of medicine is focused on the drugs, on the prescribing. And don't get me wrong, they have a role. Absolutely. This morning I was just arguing on one of my Facebook carnivore groups about statins and the role of statins and so forth. So, they do have a role, but they're not necessarily the be all and end all. And there's other ways that we can manage things. Basically, over the years, I've been just honing this, and I never knew it had a name. I never knew what I was doing anybody else was doing. I just thought I was this kind of outsider in medicine trying to not prescribe people medications. And then I don't even know how I even came across it, but I stumbled across lifestyle medicine and read into it. And I just kind of instantly went, this is me, like, this is my jam. And then I just signed up like straight away to do the board certification. And as I read more and more into it, and I thought, these guys really are trying to do what I'm trying to do. And I'm not alone. There's actually millions of doctors around, or maybe thousands of doctors around the world that are actually doing this. This is a really big thing. And so I just, signed up kind of there and then. Of course, as you said, though, lifestyle medicine, we talk about the 6 pillars of lifestyle medicine, but one of those, of course, is plant-based nutrition. Now, as your viewers obviously heard you introduced, I am not currently eating a plant-based diet. And I don't necessarily advocate for a plant-based diet. So I am what at the moment people are terming carnivore. This has been around for a long time. It used to be called zero carb. And I believe it was Dr. Sean Baker, who some people may know of. I think maybe 7-8 years ago, perhaps now, something like that. He kind of coined this term, carnivore diet, wrote his book, which is still on my reading list. I never get time to do anything. I really want to read these books. I don't have time. Yeah, and basically the premise really is there zero, or as close to as possible, of zero carbohydrates, which is taking low carb obviously to the nth degree. And then of course the removal of plant-based materials, or predominantly, plant-based materials from the diet. And the reason I got into this was actually because of a patient. I think a lot of what we do as doctors that work in this kind of space, yourself, I'm sure, often we've either had a personal story, health story, or a patient's, stories resonated with us somehow. Often it's a mix of the both. And he basically came in one day and just said like, yeah, I'm doing carnivore. And I said like, what's carnivore? Like, what is this? I don't know what this is. I said, I'm basically pretty much just eating meat and saturated fat and cheese and butter. And I was just like,
holy hell,
dude, you're going to kill you. Yeah. You're like, you're just going to kill yourself. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Like saturated fat, cholesterol, come on. And my kind of medical brain, was just like, this does not compute. Like, I can't resolve this. But all of his issues just kind of disappeared, or the vast majority anyway, just completely disappeared. And he felt great and he looked great and his bloods were great. And by every marker we could find, metabolically, he was great. But I still couldn't quite accept it.
Do you know what's interesting when you mentioned Sean Baker? I once listened to his a podcast or something like that, and I initially listened to it thinking, oh, what a load of codswallop this is going to be. This is just going to be just such BS. And I went in thinking I was going to hate it. Came out not necessarily going, oh, this is for me, but a little more open-minded about, right, well, this is potentially helpful for some people.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of where I was at. And so I still couldn't quite accept it with this guy, but I could see that it was obviously working for him. And I thought, okay, yeah, fair enough. And then, I went to the Low Carb Down Under last year in Gold Coast, 2022. And I heard Dr. Anthony Chaffee talk, his Plants Are Trying to Kill You lecture, which I think is possibly one of the most watched videos on the Low Carb Down Under YouTube channel. And I don't know, something kind of just clicked where I was like, okay, well, now there's a doctor actually talking about it. And I wasn't actually even aware of Dr. Baker, other people in this space at that point. And so I thought, okay, well, if there's a doctor talking about it, like maybe there's something in this. I've seen the effects it's had with this patient. I know I've had my own issues with carbohydrates, like everyone. I mean, I've pretty much tried every diet going, over the years, weight up and down, health up and down, and so on. I've never managed to stick to anything. And so I thought, you know what, why not? I'll try this. Like, I've tried everything else. And I just said, right, okay, that's it. I'll go eat steak, no plants, give it a few weeks, see what happens. If I feel awful, I'll go off it. No problem. And I didn't feel awful. I felt amazing. I felt absolutely, truly amazing. In
wow.
like less than 2 days, I just felt truly amazing. And I just kind of was like, what is this magic?
Yeah.
Like, what is this craziness? And so then I was like, right, I've got to research into this. I've got to look into this. And that's really just where my journey just kind of really took off. And that was about 5 months ago now. And I just haven't looked back.
Wow.
Since. And I've just been experimenting with my diet ever since, really, to find out what works for me.
And you know what I love about that, Suresh, is that you went in just as an experiment. And we often talk about that with any of our people, any of our followers, is just go in as an experiment. It may be great for you. It may not be great for you. It doesn't matter. You try it and see what happens. Everything we do. And because, people will often ask me, Dr. Lucy, I'm going out tomorrow night. Is it all right if I have cake? And I go, well, you know what? You're the boss of you. You get to decide. Why don't you look at this like an experiment? Have the cake, see what happens. If you can have the cake a little bit and stop at that and not go down the rabbit hole of wolfing down the whole cake, then, one small bit of cake is not going to cause chronic disease for the rest of your life. But if your experiment, you find that you then sniffing around looking for more and more sugar or more and more junk, then maybe the experiment is that actually it's easier for me to have none than some. So I love what you've just done then too. This carnivore thing, you've heard about it, give it a crack. I'll see what happens. If it doesn't agree with me, I'll stop.
Yeah. And that was, what you just said there, that was my life, like sugar addiction. And, I was saying to my wife the other day, talking about it, and I said, well, really my reality is I am still a sugar addict and I can't moderate like a lot of people. I mean, a lot of people are in that position. And I've done low carb, I've done keto, and we all know the health benefits of these. But for me, they were always a battle, from the start. Like I knew they were healthy. I knew they were good for me. I felt good on them. But it was so hard,
right,
for me mentally to stay away from that sugar. Like I would always kind of rationalize it. Oh, well, low carb, I can have up to 70 grams of sugar. So I would have 70 grams of sugar. I'd be counting out the teaspoons. Keto, I'd be like, oh, well, if 40, well, some people say 50, so I can do 50. And it doesn't really matter if I'm in ketosis or not, as long as, and then I would just creep up, and every day was a battle. And I think for probably the longest I've ever really managed to stick to any kind of, quote unquote diet was probably about 3 months, which was always long enough to see the benefits, but not long enough, obviously, for permanent change. But every day was a battle. Whereas with this zero carb carnivore, literally from day one, it's been super easy. It's not a battle. And it's now been almost 5 months with no effort.
Wow.
So for me, that's the difference it's made.
And you know what? It's so interesting because what you're describing there, and this happens for lots of people, is some people's brain looks for the loophole. It's always looking for the what can I get away with line. And so yours was doing that. What can I get away with? What is the loophole? What can I do? And I'm still within and I'm using quote unquote rules. So for you, the idea then is, okay, well, I'm just going to make it really clear for my brain. What am I doing? There's no loopholes.
That's it. That was me. I was always finding the loopholes and ways to kind of get around it, to justify, well, if I have ice cream today, I just won't eat it tomorrow. And, and I would creep so badly. And that's where like a zero carb carnivore diet may be useful for some people. If like me, they struggle to moderate, if they're struggling, to find those loopholes. And a lot of people report that those sugar addictions, they never go away, but they just stop seeing sugar as something to eat.
Yeah, absolutely. We refer to this, the sugar cravings, as fluffy. So Fluffy is the three-headed dog in J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter. And Fluffy is asleep when the music's playing in the story. And I often go, Fluffy's asleep when I keep my carbs low. And for me, it is about 20 or 30 grams and he's quiet. So when people go, are you on keto forever? And it's like, well, I've just got a threshold for which my carbs, if I keep them that low, then he's quiet. And I like that. I don't like the chit chat, the will I, won't I, the I'm going to do this, the loopholes. And for you, that threshold is obviously lower, down to zero.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's actually not zero. And this is part of my experimentation. So I do actually occasionally drink milk. And of course, milk has lactose. And I can actually drink quite a lot of milk sometimes. Now, I don't know how many grams I'm having of sugar, but, it's actually not zero. Yet, interestingly, I don't get those sugar addictions anymore.
Right. Yeah.
It's just very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is the thing that I think people need to kind of just understand is that every single person is different. So for you, drinking milk doesn't wake Fluffy up. And look, honestly, for me, eating something like bread doesn't wake Fluffy up either. I don't eat bread. I'm not that interested in it. But if I did, I wouldn't be on a rampage. But eating one Tim Tam or one Lindor ball, so milk chocolate, will do it.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Yeah, and every single person is different. And this is where it's so hard because I think people have lost the ability to be in touch with their own self. We're so used to abdicating what we should do to somebody else, whether that's a meal plan, whether it's counting points, even counting carbs, tracking apps, all of those things, because we don't know how to just eat to our own intuition.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And a big thing that I teach my patients is intuitive eating and listening to their body. And that's definitely something that, carnivore has helped me with massively. But you're right. I mean, I think people focus too much on what others are doing and what others, tell them to do, and have lost the ability to listen to their own bodies. And once you kind of reawaken that in them, it's amazing what people can then do with themselves once they learn, okay, what does this food do to me? Not what does it do to someone else? Not can they drink milk? Can they eat bread? It's just, no, can I do that?
Yes.
And then you just set that spark in them, and then they're just off, and they've just got the power then. And it's incredible.
Oh, absolutely. And, one of our favourite sayings is that eating is not a team sport. It's an individual pursuit. But we treat it like a team sport, that everyone should be doing the same thing. And if you're not doing what everyone else is doing, you're often judged, ridiculed, questioned, all of those things. And really, to use a very overused phrase, but, I say to people, you do you. You do you, I'll do me, and we're all happy.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people do worry about what can they eat in social situations. Will people judge me, especially in the carnivore community? Because it is a little bit out there, of course. Nobody will question if you order a steak and salad and you just eat the steak. Nobody will really care. But then if you mention it to someone, then all of a sudden it's a big deal.
Yeah, or if you just order the steak and you don't, and suddenly just this plate of steak arrives and everyone goes, what? A bit like, I mean, we all had that reaction though. You had it with your patient. It's like, what are you doing? You're going to kill yourself. And so I'll often say to people, look, people are sometimes just acting out of concern. They're worried about you. They love you. They're just wanting to make sure you're all right. And that's fine, but you just go, it's okay. I've got this. Oh, wonderful. Well, I am super looking forward to your talk at Low Carb Brisbane. It is going to be magnificent. And I think that there's a lot that people want to know about this carnivore movement. And I think for people who are starting out, they often want to know that there are health professionals who will support them in that journey. So if people wanted to connect with you, Suresh, where do they find you?
Yeah, so they can find me on my website. So my main kind of professional website is drsuresh.com.au. And otherwise, my podcast is called The Meat Medic and themeatmedic.com. So MEAT. And I'm on social media. Pretty much all my socials is at The Meat Medic as well. And I try and, I respond to messages, try and interact with people as much as humanly possible. It's hard working a lot, but, I try and be very responsive and just, answer questions and just chat with people.
Absolutely. Well, that sounds wonderful. And for those of you who would love to listen in person to a real life carnivore doctor, then you can hear Suresh speak at Low Carb Brisbane, which is Saturday the 20th of May. We will link all of Dr. Suresh's socials, try saying that fast, Suresh's socials, in the show notes, as well as obviously Low Carb Brisbane in the show notes as well. Suresh, I have loved our chat. It has been fascinating, and I do love the idea that you are just an experimenter, and at the end of the day, the results are all about what works for you, and that's brilliant.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me on the show, Lucy. It's been great to chat to you this morning, and I look forward to, presenting at the Low Carb Roadshow in Brisbane. Indeed,
it'll be a ripper. Okay, lovelies, have a wonderful weekend, and we will talk to you soon. Bye for now. So, my lovely listeners, that ends this episode of Real Health and Weight Loss. I'm Dr. Lucy Burns.
And I'm Dr. Mary Barson. We're from Real Life Medicine. To contact us, please visit rlmedicine.com.
And until next time, thanks for listening. The information shared on the Real Health and Weight Loss podcast, including show notes and links, provides general information only. It is not a substitute, nor is it intended to provide individualized medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment, nor can it be construed as such. Please consult your doctor for any medical concerns.